We're talking a little bit about love. And as we have suggested, we're going to deal with love over this 7-week period. We haven't outlined subjects because we haven't predetermined where we're going to go. There are many avenues, many directions. After last Tuesday, one of the gentlemen said, my golly, you've said all there is to say on love. What are you going to do next week? And I was remembering a very real experience of this order. When I first started out, I think it was my very first Sunday talk in this particular field. And I had worked very hard over this, or as we sometimes say, I had sweated on it. And at the end of the talk, I heaved a sigh of relief and felt, well, that's over. And it was on my way home. I was driving along, and all of a sudden I got this sickening sensation because I suddenly remembered that I was committing my life to talking about this thing, and I'd already said all there was to be said. But somehow, I suppose that's kind of a psychic preconditioning for involvement in this field, because as it is said, you rarely find a preacher who has much trouble finding things to say, even if he has nothing to say. You find the words for it. So we'll find some things to say about love, but the point is, love is a very deep and certainly very broad, all-encompassing subject that has many, many applications in our lives, some that perhaps we wouldn't think about. So we're going to kind of let it unfold. The study of love must rightly begin with some theory of human existence. In other words, I think it goes without saying that every person at some time in the past was born. And in the process of birth, he experienced a tremendous shock. It's probably one of the greatest shocks that we experience in life. As a matter of fact, some people have related the process of birth and death as being two great shocks. Well, many of us don't remember much about death from any previous life. And consciously, we don't remember much about the shock of birth. But in a way, it's a great shock because it's a time of emerging from the security and the warmth of the womb and being thrust out into a world of tremendous insecurity and a future that is sort of indefinite and unknown. Out of an experience of what must be referred to as oneness, the development of the human form and the fetus, the person again is projected out into a very fearsome experience of separation. He's totally dependent, at least for a while, on others, and on the cooperation of outer forces that do not always cooperate. So we find that all through our lives, one of our deepest needs, and this becomes an urge that sometimes impels us beyond the awareness. It's so deeply ingrained in us, in a subconscious force, to overcome our separateness, to leave what we can call, and perhaps should call, the prison of aloneness. And the absolute failure to achieve this aim, to overcome this prison of aloneness, to find some kind of a bridge or some kind of a means of relating to the world around us, the failure to achieve this is insanity. This is what insanity is. Because the panic of complete isolation can be overcome only by such a radical withdrawal from the world outside that the feeling of separation disappears, because the world outside from which we are separated has disappeared in our consciousness. And this is what happens to the insane person. He simply blocks out the world. Thomas Wolfe, in his Look Homeward, Angel, expresses this thought, I think, in a rather classic style. He says, "Naked and alone we came into exile. In her dark womb we did not know our mother's face. From the prison of her flesh have we come into the unspeakable and incommunicable prison of this earth. Which of us has known his brother? Which of us has looked into his Father's heart? Which of us has not remained forever prison pent? Which of us is not forever a stranger and alone, lost? Remembering speechlessly, we seek the great forgotten language, the lost lane end into heaven, an unfound door. Where? When? The feeling of loneliness is probably one of the greatest challenges experienced by anyone. And there's probably a certain amount of loneliness or a fear of loneliness in every person, because it's a carryover of this sense of insecurity, of being projected into this world. The question is, what is loneliness? The first thing that I think we must recognize is loneliness is not necessarily the same thing as being alone. Loneliness is basically psychological. A person can be alone and have no feeling of loneliness at all. And he can be involved in groups of people, such as in this room here, or out on the subway, or on the street, or in a crowded room, and still feel terribly lonely. So loneliness is basically a deficiency of the spirit, and it can only be corrected by overcoming this deficiency. Obviously, there are things that may conspire to create a situation in which you're alone. It may be the result of perhaps a death in the family, or it may be a result of being away from home in a city on a particular job. And certainly, such situations quite often do result in a sort of a chronic sense of loneliness for the individual. But it need not be so, and should not be. A lonely person is not simply a person who has been unfortunately separated by circumstances over which he has no control. If a person is lonely, he is lonely basically because he's afraid of being alone. Not because he is alone, but because he's afraid of aloneness. And he has not found a practical method of uniting with the world around him. Now, he may complain that he has no friends. And I know an awful lot of lonely people who talk about the fact they have no friends, they have no loved ones, they have no family, no opportunities to make friends. Actually, this is an excuse, but it's not the reason for his problem. In most cases, you'll find that the lonely person unwittingly arranges things in the way so that he won't be faced with having to overtly put up barriers to prevent people from getting close to him. So he always somehow subconsciously makes it very sure that his loneliness is going to be the one secure thing in his life. He's really lonely because he is alienated. He is alienated from his true self. His loneliness is not the result of conditions, but it is the result of a conditioned reflex in which he habitually reacts to all conditions. You see, loneliness cannot be overcome by getting something, by getting friends or getting situations that are going to give his life involvement. They can only be remedied by giving something. Certainly it's not that people are withholding from him, but it's that somehow, in some way, he is frustrating his potential of love. And he is withholding this deep love within him from the world about him. As we said last week, we're all creatures of love. We're created in the image likeness of God who is love. And so love is our very nature. Love is the one reality of every one of us, even if we go through all our lives not knowing it. We're lonely, not because we lack for love, but because we haven't discovered ourselves. And we look for love and acceptance from others. But we can only overcome the feeling of separation by finding this source of love within ourselves. First of all, knowing that we live in this great, deep reservoir of infinite love. We're in this love all the time, can never really be out of it, even though we're not aware of it. And that, in a sense, this is true of all persons, so we're all in love together. Now, this is a very important point, and I think a very interesting one, which can become a kind of a technique in practicing love. To know that the problems of of relating in the world around us come from our fear of people, basically because we do not have this awareness of the depth within ourselves. So that if we can get the idea, I am in love with everyone, we're all in love, we're all in this great power potential of love, that then we can look at a person and say to ourselves, not to him, of course, or he would probably not understand it, but to ourselves, or in consciousness, to say, I am in love with you. We're all in love. We're all in this great depth of love. And it's in the awareness of this relatedness in the depth of love that we find the means of bridging the gap in our relationship here. And when I know, for any person, no matter who he is, no matter how outwardly that we seem to be so far apart and that he would normally be so difficult to communicate with, if I can consciously say, I am in love with you, then we touch something of this depth within ourselves, which at the same time causes us to be very conscious of this depth within himself. And it's like the Oriental saying, the divinity in me salutes the divinity in you, the namaskar, or the Christ in me salutes the Christ in you. The love in me relates to the love in you. I am in love with you. And just the consciousness of this depth will enable us now to, as Jim Freeman puts it, look with eyes of love. And suddenly we find that we can relate, we can communicate, and we can understand. And it's important then, you see, that we use this as a means of relating to the world around us. And we can practice that, and it's a little technique that we can use every day of our lives. Wherever we go, people on the street, in the subway, at work, in our office, at home, everywhere, to get the feeling, first of all, that we're all in love. We're all in this deep reservoir of love, this deep undercurrent of love, which is the one great reality of life. We're in it. Even if, as the poet says, most people die with all their music in them, so that even if many people are not aware of this love and express none of it in their experience, yet we're all in it. And if I realize that consciousness, then I'm going to find the way through which I can break out of the prison of aloneness and communicate. In a pamphlet entitled The Test of Mutuality, Dane Rudhyar, who's talking about Jesus' emphasis on the ideal of love one another, he says, Jesus offered to humanity as a gift the antidote to the sickness of isolation in self, mutuality, which means interchange, reciprocity, and the one another in all deeds. He says the first great test of the spiritual life is isolation. Birth is isolation. All great things begin in isolation, but they can only mature through mutuality. Selfhood is singleness. Love is cooperative sharing. That which begins in self must understand and realize itself in mutuality and in love. One of the great mysteries of life is that every individual in the world stands alone. He lives his life alone, and he can never really be united with anyone. That's the startling thing. Each person lives in a separate world, the world of his own thinking. And just as no two atoms ever really touch one another, even in the most compact of substances, and this, of course, is the thing that has come along with the new insight into matter, that breaks with the old concept of the building block theory, where we assumed that atoms were at the basic root of all matter, and that if you got great enough into the depths of matter, you'd find simply these blocks of atom all put together, so that this desk would be composed of a lot of atoms that are all touching one another and all very solid. But in the new concept, we recognize that the atoms of the wood of this desk that you see themselves are composed mostly of space, and that they only appear to be solid, that it's a matter of electrons whirling around at such a great rate that it's like seeing the spokes of the wheel all sort of merge into a oneness and look like a solid plate, so that if you took out all the space between the atoms and within the atoms of this desk and reduced it to what could pass for the particles, the only so-called solid stuff involved, and reduce it all down to just those particles, that this atom, this desk in size would be reduced to the size of the tiniest speck of dust that you wouldn't even be able to see without a magnifying glass. So that what appears to be a solid structure is made up of forces acting as units that don't even touch one another. Now, this is true of the atomic structure of matter. Then we can see how much more true it is in terms of people. That no two lives, no two individuals ever completely touch one another. Even in the close relationship of man and wife in marriage. That they never really touch one another. There are always certain points of separation, and even in an emotional sense, there are always some reserves, some barriers, something withheld, much as we try to relate and to get this sense of oneness. It is only through the highest form of love that these barriers are dissolved, and then only occasionally. And in a sense, this is right, because much as we want to experience and to know and to be a part of what we call oneness, and certainly this is a spiritual relationship which we all hunger for and occasionally experience, yet each remains an individual. An individuality cannot and must not be smothered by possessiveness. This is Khalil Gibran's beautiful thought. He says, let there be spaces in your togetherness. Let there be spaces in your togetherness. Because you see, otherwise love tends to deteriorate into possessiveness, to holding on. The person who is possessive, who's over-solicitous, over-protective of his family or his friends or his so-called loved one, is basically a person who is not letting love do the relating, and so he's trying to hold on to replace that. He's desperately holding on to the person, basically because he's afraid. He's afraid of being alone. He's afraid of being lonely. And this person is a substitute for loneliness. So he's holding on for dear life. His great concern for the well-being of this person that he otherwise says he loves is his fear of losing that hold, that relationship which shields him from his loneliness. And so therefore it's not so much because he loves the person, but because he wants this person for his own, because he wants this shield. He wants this bridge. He wants this symbol which keeps him from the gnawing desert of loneliness within him. But on the other hand, in the heart of every person, there is a great longing, which some refer to as a homesickness for God. It's a longing for wholeness, for relatedness, for mutuality, for unity. And sometimes we mistake this urge, this longing, in terms of it being a longing for people. And so we may surround ourselves with people, or we may think of it in terms of things, or perhaps we think of it in terms of the sense appetite. And this quite often leads to overindulgence, to alcoholism, to drug addiction, and so forth. It is the part longing for the whole, the human self longing for unity in the universal self. And this is what love really is. Love, in a sense, is that sense of unity, that sense of oneness, which comes basically when the person, the individual, realizes his wholeness within himself, realizes that he's a part of this great creative process. And when he realizes this, then he finds himself so deeply in love, in the consciousness of love, you see, that then he feels this ease of relating lovingly to the world about him and to persons. And this, of course, is something that is only rarely experienced, as we mentioned last week. Every person is not only unique in himself, but every person is a unique individualization of the whole process. In our deeper beings, actually, there is a oneness. And here all beings are one, all individual selves are one. So that when we realize this inner unity, as it were, with God, then we feel a flow of love. And we feel suddenly at one with all persons. And obviously that oneness is going to be felt with the person who's closest to us. And in that sense, we have a oneness. But the oneness, you see, is not as much a oneness of two people together as much as it is a oneness of two people each at one with the source of love within themselves. And the test of that is that these persons who are at one, both at one, with the Spirit within, with the depth of love, can still retain a distance or a kind of separation, or as Khalil Gibran says, a space in their togetherness, and thereby can feel completely free with one another. There's no jealousy with two people who are both together at one in love. There's no fear of separation. There's no feeling that I've got to be every moment in this person's presence, you see, because that kind of love is secure. That kind of love doesn't fear loneliness. Now, a lack of this awareness of spiritual unity, the other side of the coin, is probably one of the greatest problems in our society today, because it leads to what could be called a social anemia, in which we find all things such as selfishness, envy, anger, and hate, pride, vanity, conceit, contempt for people. And out of this, in its more expanded form, come such things as injustice and greed and cruelty and crime. All beliefs in the superiority of oneself and the inferiority of others. All the basic social problems, such as the race problem, all seem to come out of this social anemia, which comes from a lack of awareness of depth or relatedness with this great center of love within. So it's so important that we condition ourselves to look with eyes of love at our fellow creatures, to look beneath the surface and to realize that each person is centered in and has within him a depth of love just as we have, and that thereby we can know that we're all in love together. Sometimes the sense of loneliness is related to our conditioning to the belief in the importance of being socially accepted, and this is so much an influence in your life and mine. In other words, in this, we always have to prove that we're a social success by being forever sought after and by never being alone. In other words, this theory goes, if a person is well-liked, if he's socially successful, he will never be alone. This is the theme of Arthur Miller's classic play, Death of a Salesman. Willie Loman, who is a tragic figure, is talking to his sons, and he says to them, "Be well liked, and you will never want." And this shows where he has put the values of life, you see. Be well liked, and you will never want. The most important thing is to be well liked. And yet, Willie Loman was probably the epitome of loneliness. And the whole theme of this very interesting play is a whole aura of loneliness that hovers over the life of a man who never quite understands himself, who never quite overcomes this awful sense of loneliness and is always somehow trying to break out of his prison and never quite makes it, because he feels that the only thing that's necessary is to be well liked. But you see, the most terrible thing for many persons is the feeling of being on the outside. This is probably at the heart and root of the almost compulsion of most of us in modern times to do the in thing. Who wants to be out? And the advertisers, of course, play this up to the hilt. You look through most of the ads in the newspapers and the magazines and the ads on television and so forth, and the appeal is toward being a part of the crowd, being involved in the in thing to do, to see this play, to read this book, to wear this kind of clothing, and the whole general outward appearance of man. Who wants to be out? Who wants to be alienated from the crowd? And so often it's expressed in terms of, say, the importance of being invited to a party or to a dinner. Not because we have any vital interest in the party or the dinner. Probably, in many cases, we couldn't care less. But because being invited is proof that we're not left out. Loneliness, you see, is a painful threat to many who have no conception of the positive value of solitude. Andre Gide says, and I think this is a very interesting line, he says that most people suffer from the fear of finding themselves alone, and so they don't find themselves at all. One of the things that I think we can see about ourselves, if we carefully consider it, is that we tend, in a large area of our experience, to be primarily reactive in thought and feeling and experience, to react to things. We react to suggestions. We react to what happens in the world. We react to what we read in the newspapers. We react to people in conversation. And, for instance, the typical small talk, so forth, of, say, a cocktail party, which is about the most exaggerated form, is this sense of reacting to the general trend of things that are being said. Someone once said that you should never say anything unless you have something to say. And it would be a very silent world, wouldn't it, if we only spoke when we had something to say. But the point is, most of what we say is reacting to things, reacting to news, reacting to people, reacting to this and that and the other. You see, the thing is that if our lives are basically centered around this kind of reactive experience, then the best way to overcome any sense of aloneness is to have something to react to. Have the television, or a newspaper, or have somebody to talk to, or even somebody to fight with, or in some way to be involved in reaction to things that are going on around me. So that when this person is alone, suddenly caught into a situation, like I suppose the classic thing would be in a hotel room in a strange town on a day when there are no newspapers and no television or radio in the room, and there you are. You're alone. And if your basic relationship to life has been as a reactive person, then your whole security is threatened. Because life has lost its continuity. Life has lost its meaning. Because the only meaning we had in life was in reacting to things. Of course, it never really was a meaning, you see. It was simply a cover for absence, for void, an illusion. But the sense of loneliness is oppressive. But the interesting thing is, and I think this is something to seriously consider in terms of a good look at ourselves and in development of certain of our own innate potentialities. This is not true with a creative person, or a person who is dealing with life creatively, a person who takes time to do some original thinking, a person who is spending time in meditation or time in seeking to explore the depths in himself. He's not at all disturbed by being alone. As a matter of fact, he enjoys the experience. He's enthused about the prospect, because then he will be free from the distractions of people and situations in the world around him, and he will be able then to kind of deal with life as he wants to, and in a sense have a few creative moments. And this is why I think the statement is so true that man is never less alone than when he's alone. Man is never less alone than when he's alone. And I think this is pointed out by a story that our friend Swami Rama tells of his teacher, who lives and has lived most of his life in a cave in the Himalayas. And Swami Rama tells about the time a reporter visited this very eminent teacher. He spent a good while talking with him, and finally he said, I can't understand how you can live out here all the time. Don't you ever get lonely out here all alone? And the man said, no. The only time I get lonely is when people like you come here. Now, a person who has spent much time living creatively can understand that. The person who lives reactively can't understand that at all. It sounds ridiculous. Because the person who deals with life creatively is a person who is, in a sense, consciously living his life from inside out. People and situations and clamor and news reports and so forth actually alienate himself from this creative process. so that he feels terribly lonely in the midst of all this, you see. Whereas the reactive person feels lonely if he's not surrounded by something that distracts him. Again, it's something that may help us to see ourselves in one way or another, and I'm sure there's a little bit of both sides in all of us. I would hope that all of us are seeking to develop more of a creative approach to life, but it's probably true that most of us live most of our lives in this reactive tendency, and so we find ourselves somewhere in between. But it is the sense of unity and of wholeness and of being in love that is the basis of solitude. I think that one of the sad parts of the culture in which most of us have grown up is the feeling that life must of necessity be busyness. This has been one of the ideals of our Western tradition. And we've tended to cripple our children because we don't realize that every child has a need for solitude. And the interesting thing, solitude comes natural to children. They have it sometimes conditioned out of them by parents and by well-meaning teachers who say it's not good for him to be alone. He shouldn't be sitting there in his room by himself. He ought to be out doing something. Must be something wrong with him. Better call the doctor. You know. And he simply wants to be alone. He's thinking, he's imagining, he's drawing, he's probably just laying back on his bed or out of doors looking up at the clouds drifting by, and he's engaging in a period that is probably more important than anything that you could dream up for him to do. But because we haven't understood this, and we haven't made a place for it in our whole ideal of life, the child tends to grow up with the idea that life is a constant effort to escape boredom. That's what his parents do. It's what everybody else does. It's what the entertainment media suggests. This is the whole thing of life. Find a way to escape your boredom. Find something to do. So that vast numbers of people are constantly on the treadmill of involvement to escape the awful sense of loneliness within themselves. Thus, you see, they lack the very basis of love. Because love is at the heart and root and the ground of this inner sense of oneness. And without this sense of oneness, obviously we have no real basis of relating to life. The interesting thing is that in our culture, it is absolutely permissible for a person to say that he's lonely, because this is a way of admitting that it's not good to be alone. So there's nothing, no one questions or criticizes a person if he says, I'm terribly lonely. They probably feel sympathetic with him and then try to do something about it. You remember the melancholy romantic song that presents this sentiment, me and my shadow? Not a soul to tell our troubles to, just me and my shadow all alone and feeling blue. And we can all kind of identify with that to a certain degree. It is also permissible to want to be alone temporarily, to get away from it all. Who hasn't dreamed and even talked of his dreams of wanting to sail away to far off Tahiti and get away from income tax and overtime and all this sort of thing? But if a person ever indicates that he enjoys being alone, not just for rest or escape, but he enjoys it for its own sake, then people may not say anything. Sometimes they do, but they may not say anything, but they're thinking, something wrong with this guy. For instance, if you tell someone that you can't do something because this is the time that you normally engage in meditation, you'll probably laugh out loud. Or at least he will think that you're one of those odd people that the world is so full of. Anne Lindbergh talks about this in her delightful book, Gift from the Sea. And I'm sure that she's speaking out her heart from the sense that she has this deep need for solitude, which nobody really understands. And she says very articulately, the world today does not understand, in either man or woman, the need to be alone. Anything else will be accepted as a better excuse. If one sets aside time for a business appointment, trip to the hairdresser, social engagement, that time is accepted as inviolable. But if one says, I cannot come because that is my hour to be alone, one is considered rude, egotistical, and strange. She says, what a commentary on our civilization when being alone is considered suspect. when one has to apologize for it, make excuses, hide the fact that one practices it like some secret vice. And yet it's a secret vice that every person needs. We need to know that we all started out in this life, as we said in the beginning, propelled against our will into a prison of aloneness, and that we have a deep and continuing need to escape, to overcome the sense of separateness. So we must realize that the key to escape from the prison is not out here in the world of people and changing experiences, but within ourselves, at the root of our being, in the consciousness of unity, of being created in and of love. So love is the key, you see, to finding freedom from this sense of separateness from the world. It's the only key, it's the only way. It's the only thing that will actually bridge this yawning chasm that separates us from everyone. Any attempt to relate in the world without this inner consciousness simply results in problems that ultimately cause us to pull back and retreat further into a complex of fear and loneliness. And you can almost forever know that if there is someone who is terribly lonely and terribly backward and retiring and seems always to pull away from the world, that this is a person who has made perhaps many attempts to relate to the world around him without a consciousness of love, without this feeling of the depth within himself. The interesting thing then, the cure for loneliness is not more active involvement in the world. You can't cure anyone's loneliness by surrounding with people. Maybe you've tried sometimes. Oh, poor lonely Joe, or poor lonesome Mary. I feel so sad. Let's throw a party for them. And so you throw a party and you invite them up and you have all the kind of friends. You surround them with people and so forth. But lonely Joe and lonely Mary and so forth are lonely, not because they don't have people, but because they can't relate to people, because they're afraid, because they do not have this depth, this consciousness of love within themselves. So everybody at the party has a ball, but lonely Mary is off sitting in the corner, still lonely, you see. You can't cure loneliness by more involvement. Paradoxically, the cure for loneliness is solitude. That's the interesting thing. The cure for loneliness is the discipline to go within, to actually go within, not just to frantically try to relate to the world outside and then close the door, but to open the inner door, to go within to the deep source of love and wholeness, to find the self in love. Because loneliness, you see, is a longing for unity. It's a longing for wholeness. It's a longing for God, if we want to use the term. So, though it's true that the loneliest people, so-called, in the world are people who have been somehow cut off, like people in retirement, people who have lost a loved one in later years in life. And quite often it may be suggested that what you need is to come to the friendship club or to involve in social busyness. But actually, the answer is not in this direction at all. It's in self-discovery, self-realization. It's in a discipline of meditation upon the process and the principle of love within, knowing that you are loved and that you are in love always, all the time, not just occasionally. And the interesting thing is, when you begin to feel this inner source of love, the whole approach to life changes. You begin to find that everything is seen with the eyes of love. You love things, you love the world, you love flowers and trees, people on the street. Everywhere you go, there's this sense of feeling loved and feeling in love, because you become a channel for the unrestricted love of the infinite to flow through. You feel loved and you feel secure wherever you are, and you feel actually protected. And this, you see, leads to another very important thing. In our day, I think probably, especially in a city like New York, one of the greatest problems that many people have is a sense of fear of being on the street, especially at night, because of all the horrible things that we know are out there. Now, the point is, there is a way to shield oneself in a thought and a feeling and an actual experience of protection. And paradoxically, again, It's not by carrying a big gun. It's not by putting bars on the windows or on the doors. Because actually, the person hiding behind bars is a person imprisoned. And he's so riddled with fear that actually the thing that he fears has already come upon him in his consciousness, you see. And so it is with the person who walks on the street. I'm not saying that there are not problems there. But what I'm saying is that there is a key to protection. And that key is love. Not just facetiously or flippantly or superficially saying, I love you, I love everybody, but seeking to find that depth of love within yourself, preparing yourself before you make any foray onto the streets, preparing yourself by the realization that I am in love with everybody. We're all in love together. And I feel that depth of love within myself. And then I go forth looking with eyes of love on all that is around me. And that love not only will give you a sense of inward security, but it actually will project an emanation. And the day will come scientifically when we'll measure this emanation that goes forth from you like a cosmic ray. That is the only sure protection that you can ever find. The love protection. It's something that I think we owe it to ourselves to try, you see, because we're all involved in this thing. There's another aspect of love which I think is interesting, especially in terms of the need to escape from the kind of prison of aloneness. Charles Fillmore, commenting on the problem of cliques and ethnic groupings and family exclusiveness, says, in regeneration, our love goes through a transformation which broadens, strengthens, and deepens it. We no longer confine love to family, friends, and personal relationships, but expand it to include all things. The denial of human relationships seems at first glance to be a repudiation of the family group, but it is merely a cleansing of the mind from limiting ideas of love when this faculty would satisfy itself solely by means of human kinship. If God is the Father of all, then men and women are brothers and sisters in a universal family. And he who sees spiritually should open his heart and cultivate that inclusive love which God has given as the unifying element of the human family. Just to the extent that we separate ourselves into families, cliques, and religious factions, we put away God's love. Now, I think that this is a very important thing, because many persons, depending upon their background, many persons have come through family relationships where there's a tremendous emphasis put upon family unity. Quite often, if someone from this group wants to marry, the person who is going to marry has to decide, I marry your family. And quite often, and I've experienced this in a good bit of marriage counseling, that quite often there is a very strained relationship that occurs because of the fact that one of the members of the marriage, I was going to say one of the spice, the plural of spouse is spice, isn't it? That either the husband or the wife involved in the marriage is under this kind of a pressure, you see, because the spouse is involved in a large family, and the spouse must come into this family, be a part of the whole thing, and be immersed in it, and be a part of it, to the sense that the marriage itself loses its identity. Now, this actually is an unconscious attempt to enlarge the womb, to make a womb large enough that we can live in and be a part of, you see, and still not actually leave the security of that prenatal experience. And invariably, in this kind of a family relationship, there is a great deal that passes for love, in terms of the love, close family bond where blood is thicker than water and so forth, but a total absence of anything that is at least the preparation for the dynamic of divine love. It's rather interesting, and I think a very important thing to take a look at in terms of our own relationship. Jesus talks about this. Remember, one time he was told that while he was involved in some discussions with his disciples and friends, somebody said, your mother and your brother are outside waiting for you. And he turned to the group and he said, "Who is my mother? Who are my brethren?" And he stretched forth his hands toward the people around him, and he said, "Behold my mother and my brethren." This, you see, would seem to be a rejection of that beautiful love relationship between family. But what he was saying was, you see, that if a person becomes aware of this larger heart of love in which the true relatedness of the individual is to the spirit within him, and if he becomes conscious of that relationship, then actually his love cannot be limited to just mother, father, sister, and brother. There's an awful lot of prejudice that grows out of this kind of situation. You're not a part of my clan. You don't belong to my race. You're not a part of my religion, you see. This sort of thing. Everybody else is on the outside. A great deal of limiting thought that passes for love in this type of environment. But Jesus is saying that if you experience this real depth of love, your relatedness, in another case it says, "Call no man on earth your father except your Father in heaven," you see. In other words, to feel that you are basically a son of God, that you are basically a spiritual being, and this is your blood tie. This is your relationship. And when you get that sense, that conscious sense of oneness, then you not only feel secure in a dynamic of love that will influence your whole life, but also that love becomes a universal outreach that enables you to take hands with anybody. Wherever you are, whoever the person is, whether he's from your side of the tracks or another, whether he comes from your country or another, whether he's a part of your family clique or remember the story of the Hatfields and the McCoys, good old mountain boys, and shot guns at each other throughout their life, even if it happens to be somebody from the other side of the mountain, that you still feel that ability to relate lovingly because you have found the root of love within yourself, not in a substitutionary way in a family grouping or in a clique or gathering of one kind or another. And this is very important because I think this is one of the great influences in a kind of negative sense in the lives of many of us. So to gain the consciousness of love and the feeling that Dane Rudhyar calls mutuality, we need to find an awareness that transcends the exclusiveness of love. And I'm going to read some thoughts from Erich Fromm, which read very beautifully and very poetically and sound very much like Scripture, but I think are so appropriate of our whole consideration tonight. He says, "Love is not primarily a relationship to a specific person. It is an attitude, an orientation of character, which determines the relatedness of a person to the world as a whole, not toward one object of love. If a person loves only one other person and is indifferent to the rest of his fellow man, his love is not love, but a symbiotic attachment or an enlarged egotism. And yet most people believe that love is constituted by the object and not by the faculty. Because one does not see that love is an activity, a power of the soul, one believes that all that is necessary to find is the right object, and that everything goes by itself afterward. This attitude can be compared to that of a man who wants to paint, but who, instead of learning the art, claims that he has just to wait for the right object and that he will paint beautifully when he finds it. If I love one person, I love all persons. I love the world. I love life. If I can say to somebody else, I love you, I must be able to say, I love you in everybody. I love through you the world. I love in you also myself. I think those lines are so classic that I feel like I want to say, thus saith Erich Fromm. Actually, in our consideration of love during this Lenten season, we are suggesting that this become an actual project of research and experimentation and application of certain fundamentals. So if there's anything that we've discussed tonight that seems worthy of attention, then let's follow through and commit ourselves to do something about it, so that as the weeks go by, we can at least have the involvement in a love experience. And we can almost guarantee that you'll never be the same. Perhaps the results may not be exactly as I would think in advance or that you would, but something great will happen to you because this is the way love works. So tonight, as you go on your way, we suggest certainly that you think in terms of getting yourself centered in love, to know that you are in love with everybody. You're in love. Everybody is in love. And this depth of love is the one reality at the heart and root of all persons, even though they may frustrate it. Get that feeling that you are in love with all persons. And as you go forth tonight, you will be surrounded by a protecting presence. It will give you a sense of security and an actual protection beyond anything you could find otherwise. All right, now as we go on our way tonight, let's just for a moment get this sense of oneness in love. Each of us here in this room tonight who have felt a sense of unity in our common seeking for the truth, at least we can say of each other and feel comfortable in this, we are in love together. We are in love together. And to the person right next to us, in a very impersonal and a very deeply spiritual way, touching the awareness of this great energy of love, which is the one reality of our lives, we can say silently to ourselves, to the person on either side and behind and before us, I am in love with you. We are in love with each other. We are in love together. And let's know that just in this little way we can begin to break down the prison of our aloneness and find a way to relate in the world, not superficially, not in the glad-handed, hail fellow, well-met way, which often covers up a void of loneliness, but a deep, sincere, natural, spontaneous, and friendly way of letting the Spirit in us reach the Spirit in all persons. So we give thanks tonight that each of us may be conscious of this great, infinite energy of love at the heart and root of our being. We're in it, and we're all in it together. It is the one reality of our lives. We express it easily, freely, spontaneously, and we give thanks for it. Amen.